two young men, same kind of behavior, but when we talk about issues of race and justice, we're talking about race and social class, we're talking about what resources different communities have to address problems. It's not just a question of you committed a crime, therefore you will be punished, but who are you, where do you stand in the community, how do you navigate through the system, and what is the system set up to do. So I think we want to keep that in our minds about that this is not just a simple equation, it's very complex and it's very much related to different community structures. So where did mass incarceration develop from? What do we know about some of these dynamics? Well, there's lots of people have looked at this from different directions. I won't go into all of that, but let me just say, even though there's lots of theorizing and analysis about mass incarceration as a means of social control, in some respects, you know, this sort of need for social control in this case didn't arise it wasn't solely made up in the sense of, you know, inventing a problem that needed to be addressed. Because in fact, over the last several decades, we have had public safety problems that did need to be addressed. If we go back to the early days, you know, the prison population starts to rise in the early 1970s in this country. But between the mid-60s and the mid-70s, crime rates were going up in this country. The data back then are not as good as they are now, but nonetheless, it was a significant rise in crime across the board for a period of about 10 years. Looking back on it, we now know that some of this was due to the sort of rise of the baby boom population, post-war population. So we now had a group of young men, 15 to 24, and all other things being equal, you see higher rates of involvement in crime across the board with that group. There was increased urbanization in that time. That's often associated with higher rates of crime. So there was a real problem. It wasn't entirely illegitimate to say we should do something about that problem. Similarly, in the 1980s, in terms of the drug issues, there were some real problems there as well. Beginning in the mid-80s, the introduction of crack cocaine, first the East Coast spreading to other areas, created real problems. Crack is a bad drug, so is heroin, so is cocaine, many other drugs as well. What was new here was that we had a new drug markets being developed, and we had these turf battles being established over who had control over the drug markets, and these were much worse than they could have been because you also had young men, sometimes young women, with easy access to illegal weapons as well, and so you had these turf battles that could turn very violent, and some very bad things happened, high rates of violence, murder in some communities for a period of time. So this was a problem, just like the crime rise had been a problem. The challenge, though, is how do we deal with this problem? What is the method of choice of addressing the problem? To what extent do we view this as a problem of race, poverty, unemployment, community function issues? To what extent is it viewed as a criminal justice problem? When we define it as a criminal justice problem, the answer is very simple. It involves more punishment and more prisons. And depending on the nature of the communities we're talking about, the people, tells us a lot about how we come to that definition of the problem. We can see this very clearly, the whole history of drug policy going back 100 years or so. If we look at the history of marijuana and how it's viewed in society, we had a period in the 1930s, this was sort of the reefer madness period, and marijuana was this demon drug, and during that time, the image of the pot smoker was somebody who was in one of these sort of so-called racy parts of town, the nightclubs. It was basically blacks and Mexican Americans with a popular image. Whether or not that was accurate, that was a popular image about who was smoking pot in those days. Well, then, flash forward to 1960s, all of a sudden we have millions of young people who looked like me starting consuming marijuana in great numbers on colleges, campuses, and elsewhere. And almost overnight, public attitudes towards marijuana shifted dramatically. We had calls for decriminalization. Marijuana became celebrated in popular culture, a whole different perspective on the drug. Now, nothing at all had changed about the drug itself. It was just the perception of the user that had changed, and miraculously, public attitudes changed. Now, you can think marijuana is a great drug or a terrible drug. We're not here to talk about that. The idea is, how do we evaluate what is a problem, what we should do about that? So 20 years later, along comes crack cocaine. We have problems there. How do we address the problem? Well, Congress, in all its wisdom, adopts extremely harsh mandatory sentencing policies in record time, with no consultation with experts in the field, no hearings, just based on their perception of the problem. Their perception was crack was a so-called black drug in terms of users and sellers. And again, whether or not that was accurate, that was the public perception, and all of a sudden their field of vision became very narrow. The only thing that could be imagined was, we need to deal with this as a criminal justice problem. We need to punish people. That's the only way we can address it.